the Black Panthers in Seattle were quite active. They had a program of free breakfasts on Saturday morning, and at that time, that was the height of the civil rights movement. And the Black Panthers kind of personified a lot of the so-called protest that was going on, not only in our city, but across the United States. They had not engaged in any kind of violent activity in Seattle, as they had in a couple of other cities, in other cities, Los Angeles and Philadelphia and elsewhere. They were fairly benign. My first real, and of course I observed the Black Panthers, as did most people, and they did not really come to the public attention of the Seattle Police Department or me, other than what was generally the perception by the public. Now, you have to keep in mind at that time the Black Panthers had fuzzy hair. They were saying kind of outrageous things, and people were naturally a little bit frightened, not only of our little local Black Panther chapter, but across the country. They were seen on television, you know, making pretty outrageous statements, threatening statements that created a lot of problems for some people. But as I say, in Seattle, we did not have anything to really warrant any kind of a major public reaction against the local members of the local chapter. I first became aware of issues involving the Black Panthers when I received a telephone call one day in my office. Not on the regular phone, but on the special phone that I had, which was connected to the police and the fire departments. My chief of police, Frank Moore, called and said, "Mayor, I have to talk to you right away." As was the case. He didn't call often, but as was the case, when he called, we canceled a calendar. He came directly across the street and met with me and one of my aides. He advised me that he had received a call from the Justice Department, Alcohol and Tax Firearms Division, that they wanted to conduct a raid on the local Black Panther headquarters. We discussed it at some length, and I said, "Well, Frank, what is your recommendation?" He said, "Well, I have real mixed emotions about it because they haven't caused any problems." And he said, "I really have to tell you something in confidence, Mayor. We have an informant who is living in the house where their headquarters, I think, was on 11th Avenue, or 10th, or somewhere up there. And he said, we know of only one fairly minor illegal activity that's going on." And he said, I kept pressing him, "What is your recommendation of how we should resolve this?" And he said, "Well, I don't think that we really need to raid the Black Panthers at this time." I have to put this in context. There had been a raid in Chicago where several of these young men were literally gunned down in their bed. The same thing had happened in Philadelphia, and the same thing had happened in Los Angeles. Now, the Nixon administration was getting a lot of political capital out of this. It was very popular because, again, as I mentioned, they were saying some pretty outrageous things in the Justice Department. Mr. Mitchell was the Attorney General at that time, and it was a popular political thing for him and them to do. And so I realized at that time that if we didn't proceed with this raid with the Justice Department, that there could be some real political ramifications. So we both agreed, the chief and I, that we would not do that. We would not conduct a raid in Seattle. So I felt, and he agreed with me, that Seattle was different from Philadelphia and Chicago and Los Angeles and wherever else in the country where these raids were taking place. So he left, went back to his office, and then called again and said that the Justice Department had some young man in town, and they were very unhappy, and they wanted to meet. We did. the following morning, and he made the statement that they might go ahead and do it anyway. And I said, well, that's certainly your prerogative, but I said, I don't think that you can marshal more than maybe 30, 40, at most 50 federal marshals and other federal officials. And I said, if there's violence, the Seattle Police Department will respond, of course, as is our duty, and we'll determine when we arrive as to who the aggressors are. He was quite put out, left, very unhappy, and went back to Washington, D.C., and that was the end of it. They decided not to conduct a raid in Seattle. They thought they were going to embarrass me, so they leaked about a week or 2 weeks later the fact that I had refused to condone and approve and involve the Seattle Police Department in a raid on the Black Panthers, and it was national headlines. It was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and of course the banner headlines here at home and across the country. And then the excesses, and I was castigated. There was locally there were a couple of editorials saying I was soft on crime, etc. But then again, the excesses started to become public. The district attorney, who had led the raid in Illinois, in Chicago, after the facts started to come out, was actually indicted. And the political tide turned against the Nixon administration and against Mr. Mitchell. And things became, there was more support for me at that time that was a wise decision to make. There are a couple of footnotes to that story. One of the footnotes occurred about a year later when I was back in Washington, D.C. with one of my young aides and with Senator Magnuson's young aide, who happened to be who happens to be now a congressman from I think the 5th District, Norm Dix. Norm was Magnuson's administrative assistant at that time, and he was there representing the senator, and the three of us were in a meeting with a young man named Bud Crow. Bud Crow was from Seattle initially and was the administrative assistant to John Ehrlichman, who was also from Seattle, who I'd known for a number of years before he went there and before I was elected mayor, when we both practiced law. We had a case or two against each other. And we were sitting there discussing an LEAA grant, a Law Enforcement Administration Act grant, for, as I recall, police radios for our police department. And the door burst open behind me, and in came John Ehrlichman. He was distraught. He said, Wes, he says, that was a cheap shot you took against us, because I criticized the administration for saying they wanted to turn Seattle into a Chicago or Los Angeles by having one of these raids. And he said, the president isn't going to forget this, and neither am I. And he was very red-faced, very excited. I'll never forget the look on Norm Dick's face when he thought, gee, we're in trouble here. Well, as it turned out, we didn't get that grant. But Senator Magnuson had a lot of clout. He was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee at the time. So Seattle didn't suffer to any appreciable degree in subsequent months and years. There are two other footnotes. One is a very personal one. When I decided I wasn't going to run again, I served my 8 years. I was making the rounds of all of the various community centers, and it happened to be one in the central area. And a very nice, attractive black lady came up to me at one of them, and she said, I want to thank you, Mayor. You've done a wonderful job, I think. And she said, I want to thank you for my son's life. And I thought, what's she talking about? Well, it turns out her son was, she was Mrs. Dixon, and her son was one of the young men who would have been in that house had it been raided, with the same results that had happened in the other cities. and that gives one a great deal of satisfaction. Serving your 8 years in office, I have many others, but that certainly was one of real satisfaction. The second footnote occurred in Santa Fe, New Mexico, about 2 years after John Ehrlichman got out of prison. He'd been sent to prison, as we all know, for his activities in the White House in the so-called Watergate cover-up. I was down there on a board meeting on a corporation on whose board I served, and we were down there for a corporate board meeting, a very nice dinner meeting. And John Ehrlichman, who happened to know the chairman of our board, and who had invited him there. John Ehrlichman was very mellow. He was almost a changed person, and we wound up, I suppose, through the whimsy of the chairman, who had arranged the seating. I wound up sitting next to John Ehrlichman, and spent the evening, a delightful evening with him. He has a marvelous sense of humor, and he was telling me about his new life as a fiction author, and also giving some advice in terms of White House entree to corporations and businesses. And he literally apologized for, as he called it, getting carried away by being the primary advisor. His title was domestic advisor to the president. And then he said, Wes, he says, you know, I feel sometimes like a beached whale. He said, every once in a while somebody comes by, one of the reporters comes by and gives me a kick to see if I'm still alive. It was a marvelous evening and a real footnote to that whole era of the Black Panthers in Seattle.